Simon Schama, in your new book, you reflect on a sense of confused national identity in England in the post-war years. To what extent do you think those questions of national identity, separate from issues of immigration or populism, have driven the Brexit debate?
Oh no, I think I think a lot of it has changed inevitably with circumstances. I mean, despite the fact that some people in the political system in Britain would love to recover what they think of as imperial kind of gung-ho spirit, that's never going to happen. And there is something, however, immediately recognizable, I suppose, even at 10 years old, you know, walking around the sooty ruins of blitzed out London with my dad, as I did, something kind of pugnacious about the way Shakespeare wrote, a sort of certain kind of ebullient bloody-mindedness, really, about being English, and it was English, really, that I think actually has run through the national bloodstream. There are two interesting aspects, Laura. If you think about the figure of John Bull, for example, who I don't talk about in the book, we think of John Bull as, you know, the ultimate bloody-minded Englishman, doesn't give a toss about anybody else, hates the French and so on. All that is true, but if you actually look at pictures of John Bull, he's this little kind of pathetic, irritating little person. So you get both the kind of boastfulness and the self-deprecation, which are, you know, the exasperatingly paradoxical aspects of British national character. I don't need to tell Australia about all that. But what's very striking, I think, what really, I think I know I didn't know it when I was 10 years old, but what was very striking was that Shakespeare was really writing at a time of national crisis. You know, there was a kind of fatwa out on the Queen, there was a religious, kind of low-burning religious civil war going on. All those things, there were terrible issues of poverty and astronomically rising prices and riots and plots and conspiracies. And what Shakespeare delivered was nonetheless a sense of we few, we band of brothers, which you can either take as kind of sentimental fairy tales or something really which caught something needful in the kind of Anglophone community. And he was doing it for the groundlings. You know, Henry V was played before people who paid very, very little to sort of stand up in the pit of the initially Shoreditch Theatre and then the Globe Theatre. So it was unlike court theatre in continental Europe. This was really a drama for the people. Growing up in, you know, fast forward to my teenage years, in the mid-late 1950s and early 1960s, because our memories were so kind of sharply tuned to what the result of militant nationalism had been, namely the war, we thought, well, even if we had no illusions about the authority and power of the United Nations, we thought, well, you know, we weren't going to go through that again. And if there was going to be some terrible conflict, explosive conflict, it would be between liberal capitalism and international communism. So the sense actually of this tribal fury, you know, would be contained within, I don't know, sport, within football, or in our case, cricket, so that it wouldn't actually be something which would surf the great roller coaster of ethnic hatred ever again. So in some sense, actually, it's caught naive professors like me, I suppose, slightly by surprise. But on the other hand, I've spent nearly all of my life actually writing one way or another about what was then rather unfashionable issues of national identity. I wrote a lot about the Dutch, for example, and the Dutch were, because they were fighting an 80-year war against the Spanish for their own independence and religious freedom, they were an extraordinary early instance of thinking of themselves, I would say, as a national community. Similarly, in the French Revolution, which I wrote a lot about, what struck me more than a kind of war of rich against poor and ordinary people against aristocrats, what struck me was, if you think about the Marseillaise and how bloody that anthem is, how intense the feeling of reinventing what it meant to be French then really was. So I shouldn't have been as surprised, I suppose, as I have been. Look, I think what's happened is that the whole world, you know, from Australia through to the United Kingdom to the United States, suffered, Australia less actually, I think, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, suffered very, very badly from the Great Recession, from the credit crunch. And the recovery coming out of the credit crunch was very, very unequal in Europe and in the United States. And it left a lot of people feeling very angry, understandably, about the inequality of that recovery. And it was very easy for unscrupulous politicians, and is very easy for unscrupulous politicians, not to blame the system or the structure or anything like that, but to blame it on outsiders, on immigrants, on people who are somehow, you know, threatening the kind of cultural traditions and homogeneity of national life. So they're scapegoats. I'm Jewish. I write about Jewish history. This is a very familiar and catastrophically squalid and wretched story for me.
You've been scathing of the way history has been used by the Brexiteers or twisted to back their cause. Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, I think actually what is very striking, of course, actually, and again, this will not be unfamiliar in Australia, I think, is that it's a characteristic of Brexiter arguments to say, well, you know, if the worst happens and Britain leaves the European Union without a deal, we got through the Blitz, we got through Dunkirk. This is an argument about the war. First of all, actually, it's, you know, we're trapped in a kind of mad cage of patriotic nostalgia. But it's inevitably almost always an argument made by people who had no experience of the war themselves. I was born in the very last months of the war, and I'm 74. Most of the people who talk about the kind of wartime, we can all get through it spirit had absolutely no experience of that whatsoever. So you can actually have a kind of, to me, rather kind of toxic cult of patriotic nostalgia, which actually essentially is it's a sort of it appeals to the gut, it appeals to feeling, it appeals to emotions, it appeals to the movies of Dunkirk rather than appealing to thought and to actual arguments about where Britain is and where Britain can go. So, you know, it takes a historian to realize how sentimentalized history can be an incredibly dangerous thing.
You've called Brexit the most spectacular act of economic and cultural self-strangulation in its history. If we think about where a Britain that has left the EU sits in the world, economically and strategically, when was the last point in history in which it seems so isolated?
It's extremely difficult to think of any point in British history where it's been so isolated. I mean, if you go back to the Middle Ages, we were part of a pan-continental Angevin empire. Before that, you know, the Norman world. Before that, the Roman world. In the 18th century, even though I suppose there was a very strong sense of kind of truculent, bloody-minded imperialism, nonetheless, we were knitted into a system of continental alliances in every war we fought, and in nearly all of our commercial transactions. There was an early trade pact with Portugal, for example, in the early 18th century. There's never been a time. That is part of the kind of fantasy world in which Brexiters live. There's never been a time, really, where we weren't deeply imbricated and, you know, raveled up with the people with whom we most naturally trade, namely our closest neighbours. So it's an unprecedented, it's a willed kind of sense of, you know, our sovereignty has been lost, we've lost control. I mean, the notion that actually during the 45 or so years, the 4 decades of belonging to the EU, Britain has somehow been a kind of emasculated, neutered, diluted Britain is self-evidently ludicrous. Nothing of the sort has been the case. And, you know, some of the conservatives, particularly the senior conservatives like John Major and Michael Heseltine and Kenneth Clarke, when asked, well, you know, would Margaret Thatcher have been a Brexiter? Say, and I'm sure they're right, absolutely not. Margaret Thatcher liked to beat up on the Europeans because we were inside the EU. She would never have been as irrational as to actually cut our nose to spite our face, which is what's happening right now.
Brexit places great strains on the United Kingdom itself. What's your prognosis for the future of the UK?
The normal thing is to say, well, historians aren't prophets, but I've gone in for a certain amount of prognosis lately. But it would be kind of foolish, actually, to speculate with any sense of absolute assurance. I'll put it this way, that I think, actually, if Britain ends up leaving without any kind of deal, if it ends up really just sort of sailing off into the fine blue yonder, then it will put incredible strain on the integrity of the United Kingdom itself. I was, bitterly against the possibility of Scottish independence, but Scotland voted by 2/3 to 1/3 to remain in the EU, and it's very difficult to deny the Scots another say on that subject if they're going to be kind of frog-marched out of the EU against the will of the vast majority. And the Irish issue, the so-called backstop, the issue of whether or not there is to be a border between the two parts of Ireland, isn't just a kind of weird esoteric footnote to this whole business. It lies at the core of the integrity of Europe, really, not just of Britain, because the EU in its origins, very early origins, as the coal and steel community, was founded after the war to try and park the most destructive atavistic instincts of, in that case, the French and the Germans, who'd fought each other over and over again with the result of mass slaughter. If the EU had to point to one huge success story, it would be the parking of equally ancient tribal and religious hatreds in Ireland. So, when Leo Varadkar talks to the leaders of the EU, the Tisich, the Prime Minister of Ireland, it's not a small thing. It's absolutely at the heart of the raison d'etre of the EU itself. So it's going to be tough, but and it's too soon to say, well, the threat of a no-deal Brexit is now gone. I don't think it has necessarily gone. Each time you think actually there can be a clearer outcome, you're disagreeably surprised. So, basically, stay tuned, I think, is the best I can do for that.
You now live and work in the United States, and you've written extensively about the Trump presidency. Is the US more vulnerable to forces that would seek to tear down liberal democracy than the UK?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. As I fly from west to east of the Atlantic Ocean and the other way around, a lot of us who do that think, well, which place is in worse shape? And you'd have to say that, of course, the founding fathers in the United States implanted in the Constitution the possibility of, a change. If Donald Trump is re-elected, and with any luck he won't be, but should he be re-elected, there's a good chance of that. He can't, unless he changes one of the amendments to the Constitution, I think it's the 22nd Amendment, he can't be president for longer than 2 terms, whereas, Brexit will be for lifetime. But what I think actually is very troubling to some of us who, and I've lived half my life in the United States now, it's not been, I'm not a recent immigrant here, but what is really profoundly troubling is, the best one would say Donald Trump's kind of lazy and ignorant indifference to the actual nature of the Constitution, or whether it's something really more sinister, that he wants to convert the rubric of the Constitution into something much more authoritarian, sort of change the nature of the presidency. I'll give you one small example, which is current right now. Donald Trump, by his own gleeful admission, finds it much easier not to appoint permanent secretaries to all sorts of departments, to the Department of Defense and other crucial departments of the government. Why? Because those particular people would have to be confirmed by the Senate, and Donald Trump would much rather have acting secretaries in various cabinet positions so that they do not have to be confirmed by Congress. So there is a whole sort of issue about whether or not he is actually usurping powers which properly belong to the separation of powers, which properly belong to Congress. He often talks about, well, he often did talk about the indispensability of loyalty of an Attorney General. Well, the Attorney General is supposed to be loyal to the American people and to the Constitution and to his constitutional duties. He's not supposed to be a kind of feudal retainer of the president. So there are all these things really, as I said, you give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt of his own ignorance. But at a certain point, actually, that ignorance becomes criminally sinister. And that does make, the blood run cold a bit. But we have, the midterm elections produced a great upheaval in the distribution of power. It turns the House of Representatives over to a different party other than the ruling party. There will be a presidential election in 2020. Anything can happen. So, the Founding Fathers did provide for a certain amount of elasticity. They were very, very conscious. America, after all, had established itself against what was thought to be the overweening, and was the overweening authority of a king. So, they're still there, kind of chewing it over, I think, in their tombs, Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson and George Washington, still looking after us, I think, actually. And I certainly hope that will be the case.
How much comfort then do you take from the results of the US midterm elections last year?
Yeah, I think the main, yes, and if you're hearing wild whistling outside, actually, it's not my kettle going off. We have, I live on the kind of ridge above the Hudson River, and we have some wild weather going on. But to your question, the one thing that was enormously, to your question, Laura, the one thing which was enormously heartening about the midterms was that Donald Trump had actually stirred up an extraordinary kind of grassroots mobilization. And a lot of it led by women, of course, and a lot of it led by agonized mothers in the aftermath of the Parkland horrible school shooting. So that in some sense, this was, even though Donald Trump loves to say that he's a force against the established elite, the radically high numbers of people voting in the midterm election, in far greater numbers than you would normally expect in midterms, meant that the democratic system of opposition was alive and well, and more people were, vibrantly engaged in politics than we've seen for some time. And, one hopes that'll be sustained. It's healthy for the future of democracy if that's sustained in the presidential election. What's very difficult, I think, to predict is that so much now turns on social media. The whole language of politics is kind of short attention span. Donald Trump is brilliantly successfully changed the kind of tone. It's gone through a ferocious coarsening so that, all this kind of reality show TV punch speech which he uses over and over again at his rallies, has become a possible way to conduct politics. And that is a kind of raw, kind of threatening politics we haven't seen for a long time.
Will it be possible to wind back the changes in the way politics is conducted and the use of executive power by Donald Trump?
I'm sure. If we're talking really about a presidency via tweets, and also a presidency that depends on falsifying the truth many times a day, every single day, just a change in the White House, I suppose I'd be naive to say it will completely correct that, but because there is a sense of, well, if he can get away with it, can someone else, possibly even more dangerous, get away with it too? But I do actually think a different occupant, even an alternative Republican occupant of the White House, I say this as someone who's clearly a liberal Democrat, would not actually treat the office and treat political language in the kind of bizarre empire of narcissism with which Donald Trump takes to the Twitter sphere every single day. So, I would be optimistic about there being enough virtuous meat in the system to reassert itself once he's gone. If ever he goes, who knows? Maybe he'll declare himself president for life, like Papa Doc Duvalier.
Finally, does history give us any examples of how we get out of this mess?
Yeah, but you don't want to hear them, Laura. It's usually by conquest, surrender, and the punctuation of different kinds of small-scale apocalypse. So you don't really want to know that. But I'll tell you one thing, and it may or may not be. reassuring, it's not reassuring really, is that the ultimate crisis which the world faces is, of course, the slow death, or I won't say death is hyperbole, but the extreme deterioration of planet Earth. And climate change, and the Earth will not die, but there'll be a radical change to what we think of as the human habitat that's brought us what's called civilization over the last 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years. And in order to arrest that, it presupposes not the kind of separation of the world into discrete national interests of individual states, but, toxic pollution doesn't stop at Donald Trump's walls or at the Great Wall of China. It presupposes a critical degree of collaboration. So even though, Trump abandoned the Paris Climate Agreement and gave a green light, and Bolsonaro's agitating against that, and Finland of all places, a populist party has arisen on the strength of saying, who needs environmentalism anyway? This is a matter of life and death for most people around the world. And that, in the long run, has to lead to a greater degree of comity and collaboration and reason and belief, above all, in the truth of science, in evidence, something which the Trumps of this world are, were it not so tragic, would say comically free to brush aside. So out of impending catastrophe may come a more benevolent attitude to cooperation.
Simon Schama, thank you so much for talking to us.
You're very welcome.